I still remember the night we met. The charity gala was buzzing with chatter, people wearing their designer best, hobnobbing and sipping champagne. Yet, amid all the glitz and glamour, it was Daniel's voice that caught my attention. He stood at the podium, wearing a classic black tuxedo, discussing the importance of giving back to society. "And remember, folks," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd and eventually locking onto mine, "the most effective philanthropy comes from the heart, not just the wallet." His eyes stayed on me just a moment too long, and then he was engulfed in a sea of admirers. I went back to arranging the name cards on the dinner tables. Volunteering had always been my way of contributing, of filling the spaces that material wealth couldn't. An hour later, as people began settling at their tables, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Daniel standing there, a nervous smile on his face. "Hi, I'm Daniel, the speech giver," he said, pointing back at the stage, almost unnecessarily. "And you are?" "Patricia," I replied. "The name, Card Arranger." We both laughed at our self-appointed titles, an immediate ease settling between us. "So, Patricia, the name, Card Arranger, would you like to join me for a dance?" he asked, extending his hand toward me. "I'd love to, Daniel, the speech giver," I said, taking his hand. And that was it, the beginning of us. Our dance was an interplay of emotions and anticipation, the promise of something more than just this night. We talked, we laughed, and we opened up about our dreams, our fears, and our pasts. Before we knew it, the night was over, and as the clock struck midnight, we shared our first kiss under the canopy of twinkling stars and fairy lights. The whirlwind romance that followed was straight out of a storybook. We traveled together, tasting the cultures of different cities. We found solace in our shared values and mutual ambitions. We complemented each other like yin and yang, each filling the gaps of the other. We talked about the future without hesitation, as if it were a book waiting to be written by us. 6 months later, Daniel took me back to the venue, where the charity gala had been held. It was empty this time, filled only with the echoes of our first meeting. He got down on one knee and proposed. "Patricia, will you be the co-author of my life story?" he asked, his eyes filled with the kind of hope that only love can bring. Without a second thought, I said yes. Our wedding was magical, filled with family, friends, and an abundance of love. It was a dream, my dream, our dream, and it was finally coming true. And so we began the first chapter of our married life, with nothing but love in our eyes and dreams in our hearts. Little did we know that life had its own plans, its own chapters yet to unfold, but in that moment, we were invincible. That was my dream life, a perfect tapestry of love, trust, and endless possibilities. It was the life I had always imagined, only better, because I was sharing it with Daniel. 2 years of wedded bliss flew by like a summer breeze, each day feeling like a warm embrace. It wasn't just our love that flourished. Our careers were on an upswing as well. Daniel's software startup had just been acquired, bringing with it not just financial stability, but also a validation of the endless hours and sacrifices we'd both put into making his dream a reality. "Patricia, we're in a position to buy a house now, a real home where we can start a family and grow old together," Daniel said one evening as we sat on the balcony of our rented apartment, the city lights flickering in the distance. "I've been doing some thinking too, Daniel. I found a few properties online that we might want to look at. They're a bit on the higher end, but I hesitated." "Let's go for it," he interrupted, as if reading my mind. "If we're building a life together, let's build it the way we've always dreamt of." And so began our search for the perfect home, a home that wasn't just bricks and mortar, but a reflection of the life we had built and the future we envisioned. After weeks of scouring, we found it. A sprawling estate worth $6 million, nestled on a secluded hilltop. It had a majestic garden with blooming flowers and ancient trees, marble fountains that whispered the stories of old, and an imposing facade that promised the comfort of dozens of rooms. As we toured the property, I felt a strange mix of awe and belonging. When we walked into the grand living room with its tall arching windows and ornate chandeliers, Daniel looked at me and said, "This feels right, doesn't it?" "It does," I nodded, picturing our lives unfolding within these walls. This can be the backdrop of so many milestones. Birthdays, anniversaries, family gatherings. "And hopefully, children running around someday," Daniel added, squeezing my hand gently. We made an offer on the spot, and it was accepted. Within weeks, we were handed the keys to our dream home. The moving in process was an adventure of its own, each room filling up with not just furniture, but also our shared hopes and dreams. We celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary there. just the two of us, in a small but elegant party we organized in the garden. "Here's to us," Daniel said, raising his glass, the twinkle lights around the garden reflecting in his eyes. "Here's to our castle of dreams." "To us," I echoed, clinking my glass with his. That home was more than a property. It was a symbol of our aspirations, achievements, and above all, our love. We didn't just invest in real estate, we invested in our shared future, a commitment not just to each other, but to the life we had always envisioned. And for 3 glorious years, that home was the epicenter of our universe, a castle that held within its walls a fairy tale that was uniquely ours. Little did we know that life was scripting a different kind of story, one that would challenge not just our love, but our very essence. Yet in those years, in that home, we were kings and queens of our own castle, rulers of our destiny, living each day as a tribute to the dream we had so passionately crafted together. The first sign was subtle, a cough that wouldn't go away. We brushed it off as a minor inconvenience, something that would pass. But when Daniel started experiencing fatigue and unexplained weight loss, we knew we couldn't ignore it any longer. "Patricia, I'm going to schedule a doctor's appointment. This doesn't feel right," Daniel said one night, the worry evident in his eyes. "I think that's a good idea. It's better to rule out anything serious," I replied, though a knot of dread was slowly forming in the pit of my stomach. The hospital visit was supposed to be routine, a precaution. But when the doctor looked at Daniel's test results and recommended more tests, that knot of dread tightened. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, pacing in sterile hallways and sitting in clinical rooms, the diagnosis came. "We'll fight this," Daniel said as we sat in the car, staring at the hospital building we had just left. "We've overcome obstacles before. We can do this too." "Of course we will," I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. From that point on, our fairy tale life morphed into a never-ending cycle of chemotherapy sessions, hospital stays, and medical consultations. Our beautiful home, our castle of dreams, turned into a backdrop for a life we hadn't chosen but had to face. The first round of chemo hit Daniel hard. He lost his hair, his complexion turned pale, and his vibrant energy seemed to drain away. But what remained unbroken was his spirit. He'd still manage a smile, even after hours of painful treatment. "How are you feeling?" I would ask, watching him lie on the hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding him. "Like I've been run over by a truck, but I've got the best nurse, so I can't complain," he'd quip, his eyes meeting mine in a moment of shared understanding. And so we fought, taking each day as it came. Our social life dwindled. The parties and get-togethers became a thing of the past. Instead, our world shrank to the confines of our home and the hospital. The smell of antiseptic and medication replaced the aroma of home-cooked meals. The sounds of laughter and music were replaced by the beeps of medical equipment. We became warriors in a battle we never signed up for, armed with love, faith, and sheer determination. But despite our strongest defenses, the disease infiltrated, weakening Daniel's body day by day, month by month. After a year and a half of battling this insidious enemy, Daniel's doctor pulled me aside. "We've tried everything, Patricia. It might be time to consider other options. Hospice care, perhaps." I felt my world shatter. No amount of fighting, of love, of dreams, seemed enough to hold the Grim Reaper at bay. It was a battle we were losing, despite giving it our all. But in that moment of despair, Daniel looked at me and said, "We knew this was a possibility, Patricia. But we fought, and we loved, and that's what matters." His words, simple yet profound, reminded me that even in the face of the cruelest interruptions, we had each other. And that had to be enough for now, even when facing the unknown chapters that lay ahead. The last days were a blur, a jumble of hospital visits, hushed conversations with doctors, and quiet moments alone with Daniel. Time seemed to stretch and contract in unpredictable ways. Minutes felt like hours when we waited for test results, and hours felt like minutes when we shared what we knew could be our last meaningful conversations. "I want you to be strong, Patricia," Daniel said one evening as we sat in the dimly lit hospital room, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Promise me you'll move on, find happiness again." I looked into his eyes, seeing a lifetime of love and shared experiences flash before me. "I can't imagine a life without you, Daniel," I choked out. "You won't have to," he said softly, "because I'll always be with you, in every memory, in every decision, in every moment of happiness or sorrow." 2 weeks later, Daniel breathed his last. There was a stillness that washed over him, a kind of peace that seemed almost surreal given the turbulence of the past year and a half. When his eyes closed for the last time, I felt a part of me die with him. The funeral arrangements were draining, a numbing sequence of tasks that felt incredibly trivial in the grand scheme of things. Where should he be buried? What kind of service should we have? Each decision was a painful reminder of the void Daniel had left behind. I'm planning to bury him in my hometown, I told his sister Emily during a phone call. Would you like to come? I think I'll stay here, she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. I'll look after the house for you. All right, I'll leave you a set of keys then, I said, a subtle sense of unease creeping in, but I was too emotionally drained to give it more thought. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by family and a few close friends. As the pastor recited prayers and hymns, I couldn't help but remember our wedding day, the promises made, and the dreams shattered. I laid a single rose on Daniel's casket, a symbol of the love that would never fade, even in death. Goodbye, my love, I whispered, tears blurring my vision. You'll always be a part of me. With a heavy heart, I left my hometown and returned to what was once our sanctuary, our dream home. I expected it to be a painful experience, filled with haunting memories and echoes of a happier time. What I didn't expect was to find that the locks had been changed. Confused and anxious, I rang the doorbell, and a moment later, Emily appeared at an upstairs window. Take your things and get out, she shouted, her voice filled with malice. I stood there, stunned, as the reality of the betrayal sank in. This was not just an end to Daniel's life, but also an ugly, scarring chapter of my own. In that moment, I realized that farewells are seldom clean breaks. They often leave you shattered, picking up the pieces of a life you once knew. As I turned away from the house that was no longer mine, I felt a cold rage replace the emptiness. Emily had taken away my home, my sanctuary, but what she couldn't take away was my will to fight. And so, armed with the memories of a love that once was and the bitter lessons of a farewell I hadn't chosen, I decided it was time to pen the next chapter of my life. A chapter that would honor Daniel's memory, but also hold those accountable who had wronged me in my most vulnerable moment. As soon as I left the premises of what was once my home, I dialed the number of Alex, a lawyer who had been a family friend for years. I recounted the unbelievable turn of events, my voice steady but tinged with an undertone of disbelief and fury. Patricia, this is serious. If what you're saying is true, Emily's actions could be considered unlawful, Alex said, his tone equally serious. She can't just throw me out of my own home, can she? I mean, Daniel and I bought that house together. It's as much mine as it was his. We'll have to look into the legal aspects, especially considering there's a significant estate involved. But before we get to that, you need to document everything, conversations, incidents, anything that can be used as evidence. I will, Alex, and thank you. You have no idea how much I appreciate this. I returned to my rented apartment that evening, my mind awash with a cocktail of emotions. Grief for Daniel, betrayal from Emily, and a renewed sense of purpose. I began the arduous task of documenting the unthinkable betrayal, jotting down every interaction I had had with Emily since Daniel's diagnosis. I even managed to get a written statement from the neighbor who had seen me trying to access my home, my hands shaking as I inserted the key into a lock that had been maliciously changed. Just when I thought the tide was turning, a knock came at my door. 2 police officers stood there, stern and official. Patricia Williams, one of them inquired. Yes, that's me. What's going on? You're under arrest for unlawful entry and trespassing. My heart sank as they handcuffed me and led me to their patrol car. I was taken to the police station and booked for crimes I had not committed. During the process, Emily showed up, her face twisted in a malicious grin. My brother wouldn't have allowed this. Why are you doing this? She shouted, as if she were the victim in this twisted tale. I chose not to respond, speaking to her, defending myself. It all seemed futile. She had stooped to unimaginable lows to rob me of my home, my sanctuary. What good would talking do? I called Alex from the station, recounting the latest episode of this waking nightmare. After hours of legal wrangling, he managed to get me released, but not before I had to pay a hefty $10,000 fine. Patricia, we have a long battle ahead, Alex said as he drove me back to my apartment. But I promise you, we'll fight this. What Emily has done is not just morally reprehensible, but likely illegal as well. She will not get away with it. As I stepped into my apartment, a space that now felt like the only refuge in a world that had turned hostile, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was different. Hardened by betrayal, yes, but also resilient, ready to fight. Emily had not just underestimated the law, she had underestimated me. She had torn my life apart, believing she could get away with it. But what she didn't know was that adversity, far from breaking me, had fortified my resolve. In that moment, I made a vow, not just to myself, but to the memory of Daniel, the man who had loved me unconditionally, whose absence I felt with every heartbeat. I would not let his sister tarnish his legacy or rob me of what was rightfully mine. As I began preparing for the legal battle that awaited, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Emily had initiated this war, but I was going to end it, and I wouldn't rest until justice was served. It was time to turn the page and write the next chapter of my life, one where the villains faced the consequences of their actions. And as I lay in bed that night, the events of the past few years flashing before me like scenes from a movie, I knew one thing for certain: the next chapter would be written on my terms. Weeks turned into months as I gathered evidence, working closely with Alex to build a bulletproof case. It was an emotionally taxing period, but the fury that Emily's betrayal had ignited in me served as the fuel I needed to keep going. Alex warned me that the legal process could be long and convoluted, but I was prepared. Prepared for the long haul, prepared to fight for justice. On the day of the court hearing, my palms were sweaty as I walked into the courtroom, wearing the most formal attire I had mustered since Daniel's funeral. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a court case. It was the arena where I would reclaim my life. "Are you ready?" Alex whispered as we took our seats. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. Emily was already there, her eyes meeting mine with a gaze that was as cold as it was defiant. She was flanked by her own lawyer, a sleazy-looking man who shot me occasional smirks that made my skin crawl. The judge, a stern middle-aged woman, entered the room and the court was called to order. "The case before us concerns the dispute of property ownership and alleged unlawful eviction," she began. "Let's proceed with the opening statements." Alex was the first to speak, presenting our case with a clarity and logic that left no room for doubt. He outlined Emily's treachery, backed up by evidence, text messages, and eyewitness accounts. "Your Honor, the defendant exploited a family tragedy to unlawfully evict Patricia Williams from her own home," Alex concluded. "We're here to set the record straight and ensure justice is served." Then it was Emily's lawyer's turn. His arguments were flimsy at best, based more on theatrics than facts. "Your Honor, Emily had every right to change the locks, considering Patricia abandoned the property when she left for her hometown," he argued. "But it was to bury her husband, my client's late husband," Alex countered. "A temporary absence for a family emergency doesn't warrant an unlawful eviction." After a series of back and forths, the judge announced that she would render her verdict the next day. The tension in the room was palpable as we filed out of the courtroom, each side casting wary glances at the other. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind was a whirlpool of what-ifs, but amid the chaos of my thoughts, a voice of reason emerged. I had fought the good fight, armed with truth and justice. And that would have to be enough. The next morning, the courtroom was charged with an atmosphere of expectation. As the judge walked in, you could hear a pin drop. She took her seat and looked across the room, her gaze finally settling on me. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, it's clear that Patricia Williams was unlawfully evicted from her property," she began, and my heart leapt with hope. "I hereby order the immediate restoration of Mrs. Williams's residency, as well as compensation for emotional and financial damages incurred." Emily's face turned a shade of red I had never seen, her eyes widening in disbelief. Justice had been served, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a full, deep breath. "Thank you, Your Honor," Alex said, turning towards me with a victorious smile. "We did it, Patricia." "We did," I replied, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter, the world a little less oppressive. The house, that symbol of both my love for Daniel and the betrayal I had endured, would be mine again. But more importantly, I had regained my dignity, my sense of self. As for Emily, I never saw or spoke to her again. Her betrayal was a life-altering lesson in the fragility of trust and the harsh reality that family isn't always forever. But it also taught me something invaluable, that in the face of adversity, I was far stronger than I had ever given myself credit for.